Australian cinema started in the 1900s, and the first feature film was The Story of the Kelly Gang in 1906. Then in the 1950s, the first Indigenous person named Robin Tata Wali lead role in a film was in Jeddah. We also had the first female named Naria Kenoff to lead the role in a film.
Our duty to try and do something with them. Bring them closer to our way of living.
Then in the 70s, Australian films had the first interracial kiss in the number 96, and the characters are Ronnie Arnold and Lynn Rainbow. The films were typically set in outback Australia in the 70s. Then by the 80s, Australia started looking at the roles of women in Australia's society, and we had one particular film called The Man from Snowy River that is based on the poem about women's roles. Then by the 90s, Australian films were made about people with a disability or showing domestic violence and the way gender stereotypes were happening. The most famous Australian film that showed about disability and domestic violence at the time period was Bad Boy Bubby, that came out on the 28th of July 1994 and won an ACT award. Also that year, Priscilla the Queen of the Desert came out. We have themes in Australia cinema that we can break down into different cultural film themes. In the Indigenous themes, in 1939, in the film called Uncivilized, we see Indigenous people being portrayed as uncivilized, like an animal, savage, and as a caveman. Then in the movie Bitter Springs, it shows assimilation to the Indigenous people.
I've got title to this land, haven't I?
Mr. King, when whites take over Abo land, there's three ways of dealing with the natives. 1, you can shove them off. 2, you can ease them off. And 3, you can find some way of taking them in with you.
Although Jeddah uses Indigenous lead actors to also portray assimilation too, at the time they had policies in place by the Australian government. Then in 1967, the film called Journey Out of Darkness showcases some Indigenous people in the movie, but not as the main character, as he was played by an white actor in blackface. Then in the 70s, people started to accept Indigenous people, like Walkabout, and it showcased the writers had started to understand Indigenous culture. Then in the 90s, people's perspectives and views started to change to understand Indigenous history, and films like Rabbit Food Fence, Rayons, and The Sapphires, and depicted more accurate Indigenous history and culture. Then came the 2000s, now we see TV shows and movies about Indigenous issues.
Proudly in support of that.
We are oppressive people!
Some cameramen come rushing into the room and said, "Oh, we've got to get off the island. Something's going to burn tonight."
Like Redford Now showcases Indigenous community issues, and the movie and TV show came out in 2014. Australian cinema is also associated with Screen Australia. They are encouraging people who are Indigenous, who are trying to make films, by providing additional funding for Indigenous films and TV. Screen Australia did a report, Seeing Ourselves, reflection on diversity in Australia TV drama in 2018. In particular, the difference between culture background in TV drama in Australia to Indigenous people as the main character that I am looking at. In the first graph, it shows the difference in the percentage of the population to the culture background in TV drama as the main character. It shows 5% representation as the main character in TV drama to 3% population representation showing overall higher representation in TV drama. Then in the second graph shows the Indigenous characters are being played by Indigenous actors in TV drama shows. Screen Australia is doing good things in they are providing funding and support to Indigenous people who are making films and TV shows in Australia, and they are educating people by giving us a better representation about Indigenous actors played in films and TV shows in Australia.